You say all of this, and all I can think is Eve a manic pixie dream girl?
Eve is the only girl, so she's not like other girls. Indeed, she is. Correct.
I'm not like other girls. I was born from your rib.
I am not like other girls. Other girls want to be me. I am mother to other girls.
Capital M mother.
Exactly.
She could never. Hello, and welcome to the Gifted Child Symposium, the podcast in which we dredge up old forgotten childhood memories in the name of academia. Today, we dare you to remember the world of 2010's YA dystopias. Remember Delirium? Us neither, until recently.
I'm Jean.
I'm Felicia.
And welcome to the podcast. On this episode, we wanted to talk about the, in quotations, trend, but we would call it as a life-changing phenomenon. There was the YA dystopian fiction in the early 2000s into the 2010s. We will be focusing, or I think kind of bringing it back to Hunger Games, because A, it is the most well-known series from this time and genre, and it continues to like expand and stay relevant. Like, thank you so much, Rachel Zegler, we love you, and Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and we are unironically excited for the next book that's coming up like next year. So it's still relevant, but also we firmly believe that Hunger Games is a particularly nuanced series that not only exemplifies and uses all the tropes we're going to be talking about, but also subverts them and like has a comment on them. So we will be talking a lot about tropes. We will be talking a lot about, I just want to say, I think we'll be talking about more about tropes than about the meaning of the tropes, because we are so interested in what the fuck this trend was. And as Felicia said when we were planning for this episode, I think we should really think about this episode as the anatomy of YA dystopia. Why it worked, how it worked, what does that mean?
And why it didn't work a lot of the time, because
true,
like we're gonna be bringing this back to the Hunger Games, because it's the most like lucid example of a YA dystopia in my opinion. Like it to this day I still feel like it had a meaning. Suzanne Collins was trying to commentate on something relevant in our world, in our society, whereas you like the other books in that sort of space, like Delirium, for instance, I still to this day don't really know what they were trying to say, not gonna lie. And as we got more examples of this genre, I feel like authors slowly lost sight of why this genre exists and kind of started mad-libbing their world building instead of basing it on like an actual problem in society, which is how we get random stuff like Matched.
Yes. One thing to say on that before we start on the introduction. I love you, Lauren Oliver. You changed my life. Delirium was really fun. I really still like it. Dystopia, just to define it, give some background. Dystopia is the opposite of utopia. It is an imaginary society that instead of being ideal, like utopia, it is grim and basically just a bad place to live. It is often about a society afflicted by dictatorship or any type of authoritarian regime, natural disasters, famine, disease, sometimes genetic mutations, we'll talk about it. And it's just a future society where humanity is in like a slow decline and the government or whatever has happened is trying to, rescue the last bits possible. The most well-known examples of dystopia that you probably read in school are 1984 by George Orwell, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. So from 1984, we get to 2003 or whatever, Uglies.
Wait, Uglies from 2003? Wow.
Uglies is very early, yeah. Uglies is like 2005 or something.
As we said in the beginning, the catalyst, we feel like, for this trend defining the early 2010s was The Hunger Games, which is a book series by Suzanne Collins that was originally published between 2008 and 2010. But one of the bigger drivers of its success and its continued relevance in our culture is the movie adaptations. starring Jennifer Lawrence. And we recently had a prequel film and book called The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So yeah, The Hunger Games is, as we said, probably the most popular and well-known example of this genre of its era. It has all the tropes that we're going to be talking about in it, such as a young female protagonist and a tyrannical government with some sort of like quirky way of oppressing society that separates that government from perhaps present day examples of authoritarian regimes by making it almost like gamified, I guess, like, or it like simplifies the oppression to this one sort of obviously evil thing to make it easier for young people to understand.
Yes. And in the same way that makes it easier for young people to understand the antagonist, I also think it's important to say that the protagonist is also adapted for like young audiences, because they're usually young, teenage, more often than not female, and yet somehow has immense power in the tyrannical regime.
Yeah. And this genre has since spawned dozens of very similar books in tone and in premise. So we've already mentioned Uglies, Delirium, but there's also Divergent, which also got a movie adaptation series. The Maze Runner, same there. And like Matched, which we've also mentioned, and like dozens of other ones.
That we all loved. We loved.
Yeah.
We, like, I just want to say before we start ripping this apart, this is with love. Like, no one who hasn't read at least 10 of these fucking books will be able to tell you how they're insane and how they make no sense. Like, we ate it up. The kind of idea for this episode came from like a non-podcast goal, because Felicia and I still have some of those, where we were just on Goodreads on like YA books from 2010 being like, oh my god, did you remember that? Did you read that one? Did you read that one? That one was insane. That was so stupid. That was so fun. That actually was really good. So this is to say that Felicia and I learned how to read and be people through reading also dozens of these books. So yeah, we love them, and we love this trend at the same time that we have questions about it.
Yeah, I think it's really telling of how of its time these books were, because that experience me, Jane, and I had while we were on Goodreads was very much like, oh my god, I'd completely repressed this. Oh my god, I completely forgot this existed. Or oh my god, I haven't thought about this since I read them and was obsessed with them. Yes. And I haven't had like a coherent thought about them ever, because I didn't question them. They were just like fun serotonin fuel for my brain when I was 14.
They were the Instagram, they were the TikTok on Instagram reels of the time. It was just the same thing over and over, and I loved it. Yeah.
And now looking back on them, we're reading the synopsises on Wikipedia or whatever, and we're like, oh,
that happened.
Interesting. Yes. Interesting. Why did they do that?
And then another thing that made us really want to talk about this is Uglies, which also we totally forgot was a thing until the movie adaptation, like 15 years too late, has now dropped on Netflix, and it's apparently god awful. But god, I'm so happy we're still talking about YA dystopia.
And the other thing I want to mention, just as like context as well, is that a lot of these YA dystopian series are having a bit of a renaissance on TikTok specifically.
Yes.
Obviously the Hunger Games because of the new movie adaptation and the new books. But, like, for instance, Shatter Me, does anyone remember that shit? That's also having, like, a huge renaissance. I mean, the author just announced, like, another spin-off trilogy or whatever. So that's also contributing to it. But I wanted to point out that how trope-led these books were and how romance-focused they were for fantasy sci-fi novels really lends itself to, like, what's popular on Book Talk specifically right now, which is romantasy, which is essentially YA dystopia, but with dragons and fairies instead of the capital G government.
Sex. Yeah.
And way more sex, because they're no longer for children. They're for the grown-up adults who used to read Shatter Me 10 years ago. But now we're older and we want the same thing, but with sex.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And talking about TikTok, the questionable title of this episode comes from the fact that I was like scrolling on TikTok a few months ago and I saw Sydney Jean, who is a screenwriter and influencer who famously focuses on sapphic storytelling and like subverting heterosexual storytelling. So she has a very quick TikTok of her kind of like walking into the bathroom, flipping her hair triumphantly, and the kind of text on the video says 16-year-old girls in 2010s YA movies after taking down the government that has been in power for years with nothing but heterosexuality. End quote. And I was like, genuinely though, like these, why is romance such a huge part of them? Like, why are love triangles like enough to take down like Kim Jong-un? Like, I don't understand. It just got us talking. Like, why was every YA dystopian novel a very formulaic heterosexual romance? Like, why was heterosexuality banned in a lot of these? And also, like, therefore radical to be pursued. Like, why was romance the thing that genuinely ended up having a political effect?
Yeah. And just as a legal disclaimer, we don't mean heterosexuality specifically was literally banned. We meant that romance in general was banned in some of these books, and gay people were never mentioned.
Yes.
So implicitly, it was specifically heterosexual sex that was banned in Delirium.
For disclaimer. Yeah, so true. Yeah, it's like the lack of diversity. It's like, oh my god, that incredible short film titled like In This World being gay is the norm and being straight is forbidden or whatever. Like, that is the vibe that these were given, where there was always a random thing that was not like that was banned by the government, and somehow a random girl liking a random boy was like rebellious. So why the fuck? Why was that? What does that mean? What does that mean for young readers and viewers to see these political narratives just wrapped around the romantic plot? What does it mean to consider heterosexuality radical? What does it mean to have that at the center of big bad government? Who is big bad government? Why are they coming out? Why are they coming to the, like, at the straights? Like, why are the straights persecuted? That is that is what we will be investigating here.
If George Orwell could see us now.
If Sir Thomas More could see where we ended up by being like, what if there is no gays, but also there is no straights? Thoughts?
What thoughts? So, to, I guess, cover our bases, let's kind of make a list of the main tropes of YA dystopias from early 2010s. So, like, beginning with the world building, oftentimes you'll get a society that's super secluded, like technology has either been limited or disabled or whatever. Like, so there's no outside world communication, and the society is also clearly divvied off in a way that you don't see as much in, like, our real world. So you'll have, like, for instance, factions in Divergent, districts in the Hunger Games, and the Wilds versus Portland in Delirium, and Uglies versus Pretties in Uglies. So it's like it's just a lot more segregated, but I think importantly to point out, very arbitrarily segregated.
But that segregation is part of the inequality inherent in this world. And I will say that in the case of the Hunger Games, it's more like you visualize the class system in a way that makes more sense for like a 14-year-old to be like, oh, right, the people who like coal mine have less money than the people who like make weapons. Like, it feels arbitrary, but it's also just like simplified the complex like class system of our world. Or to just call people who feel love invalids. Lauren Oliver, answer. Answer for your crimes. So yes, very randomly like divided.
And I think that also like speaks to how arbitrary the like main quote unquote problem in these societies are, like what led to this dystopia. So like in Delirium, the problem is romantic love for some reason, and in Uglies, it's physical or like the inequality between people's physical appearances, question mark. And the other main thing that kind of links all of these dystopias is the main character, who is usually / always / often just a normal girl, probably from a really impoverished part of the society, but sometimes not. She is, again, normally and usually and almost always seemingly unremarkable, not particularly pretty, not particularly ugly, not particularly strong, sometimes particularly weak, not talented, but often / always burdened with a troubled family or some kind of past trauma that makes her mature for her age, and she's also often the main caretaker for her family. See Katniss, for instance.
Yes.
When we meet her, she is the elder sibling. Her father died in a coal mining accident some years ago. Her mom is like shell-shocked from that fact still and can't provide for her family anymore. And she's got a little sister who she treasures and protects with her life. And she is really good with a bow and arrow because she needs to hunt rabbits to feed her family.
If not, also, she is orphaned for mysterious reasons, and she's normal in the way that she believes in the regime that she was, like, born into until inciting incident. So yes. It's either... But she, for always, she feels like she's abandoned in some way or another by parental figures, which is important. Like, she either takes care of her family or has no family.
Yep, that is literally it.
So she either takes care of her family or has no family, which I think is quite interesting. And I again, we don't want to shit on YA. I think YA was, like, YA dystopia was a great time to have feminist ideals, or at least, like, hashtag, like, strong female characters, because it kind of flips these traditional structures of, like, women being made into objects for the, pleasure of a male narrator. If anything, they are the ones who do not have time for love. They are the ones who do not have, like, a concern for their physical beauty, and a lot of the times have way more responsibilities than what traditionally, like, female characters have had in literature. That said, that balance is disturbed when they like a boy who somehow introduces them to radical politics.
Yeah. I also feel like that just a girl character really appealed to the fact that every 14-year-old in the world is a pick-me. Because it's the most pick-me character I've ever seen in my life. And before we continue tearing this genre apart, let's also discuss how the Hunger Games actually does set itself apart by protecting itself from a lot of the downfalls of these tropes. There's lots of video essays about this on YouTube that you can just literally Google, like, Hunger Games video essay, and Liz will come up. I want to particularly flag The Hunger Games Revolutions Are Hard to Write by Just Right and The Rise and Fall of Teen Dystopias by Sarah Zed. Both very good. I'd say the Just Right video is a really concise explanation of why the Hunger Games both fulfills all the tropes of YA dystopia, but also kind of drives its point home through the fulfillment of a lot of these tropes. And yeah, basically how the ending of the whole series, like, kind of subverts the genre. I think people forget, because of the way the movies were marketed, that the love story in the Hunger Games is really not the main point of the story. And it kind of pokes fun at the fact that we could only care about a boy and a girl suffering, like a young boy and a girl suffering because of the regime, because it is if they are in love. Like, the plot is about the commercialization of that sort of suffering, and that is the thing that Suzanne Collins set out to point out with her dystopia, like the commercialization and the turning suffering and inequality into entertainment.
And, like, the use of, like, the tragic love as a way for audiences to care.
And I think the reason why the Hunger Games is about the use of youth in political conflict and in the media, basically, is because young people hold a specific role in the imagination of the public. We are constantly putting young people on a pedestal for standing up for what they believe in, etc. I was reading a monograph by Roberta S. Treitz about YA literature. This was published in 1991, I believe, so well before the time of the Hunger Games, well before the time of any of these things that we're talking about, but I think it does apply itself really well to like what we are talking about. It's called Disturbing the Universe: Power and Repression in Adolescent Literature. And in the introduction, she writes, "Indeed, adolescents occupy an uncomfortable liminal space in America. Adolescents are both powerful in the youthful looks and physical prowess that are glorified by Hollywood and Madison Avenue, in the increased economic power of middle-class American teenagers as consumers, in the typical scenario of teenagers succeeding in their rebellions against authority figures, and disempowered in the increased objectification of the teenage body that leads many adolescents to perpetrate acts of violence against the capital S self or other, or capital O other, and the decreased economic usefulness of teenager as a producer of goods in post-industrial America, and in the typical scenario of teenagers rebelling against authority figures to escape oppression."
It points out to the dichotomy we will be talking about of like, why do these adult things have to be discussed in like from a teenage perspective? But I think that is the best way of putting it. Like, teenagehood, adolescence is a liminal space where you are no longer a kid, but not really an adult. But also in these complex societies that have gone to shit in these books, they are the victims of other people's crimes, like in the Hunger Games, but also they are given weapons and they're made to fight and represent their districts and fight for their own lives in a way that makes them more powerful than the adults who raised them. And it's just such an interesting dynamic that I think the whole just a girl meets powerful government is a perfect combination of the complicated power and disempowerment of teenagers in these books. Which takes us to, who is the big bad government? Who is the rebellion? Who, what, and where is the rebellion that the protagonist / Katniss / Lena in Delirium eventually joins? So I would love to examine the tropes of big bad government. I hope you can visualize this as all of the words are capitalized, big BBG, of big bad government. So the vibes of big bad government is that they are big and they're bad for reasons. As Felicia already said, they feel quite arbitrary. They are usually like a response to crisis, which I think is quite interesting. Like, the government came in after an environmental or natural disaster, after a civil war, like in the Hunger Games, after some sort of economic collapse. Did you know that the whole civil war in the Hunger Games started because of fossil fuels? Look that up. Or some sort of like rise of new technology that took over, or genetic mutation that affected the whole country. So from this weakened state, like it often happens in a lot of the history of authoritarianism, big bad government arose to bring order to the chaos of society in this kind of like weakened republic. So to maintain this order, the government inflicts fear and abuses its power by changing history, oppressing their population, hoarding resources, creating incredible wealth inequality, and punishing any type of dissent.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that is a trope is propaganda.
Yes.
Because it means that, like, either you have a Katniss who is, like, really not content with her life and thinks that the capital is evil, or you have, like, Lena in Delirium, who, in the beginning of the books anyway, is fully like, yeah, I need to be cured, or I'll suffer, or whatever happens.
Same for Uglies. Like, I'm really excited to get my surgery. So it is a lot about not only changing history, but also, like, changing minds in order to convince the population that this is a good idea. Because big bad government, like, believes itself to be, like, the savior of humanity, or the United States. It's often the United States. There's another whole trope of, like, where the fuck is Canada? Where is Kenya? We don't know, we don't care, because these are American authors most of the time. But yeah, like, they're secluded not only because of technology, but also because we only care about what happens in the 50 states, not Alaska. So 49. So because big bad government sees itself as like the savior of humanity, / the global West, they like they ban sorry, I just can't they ban a random thing. They demonize or ban a random thing that is meant to be like the root of all evil. Which, again, as we said, is like romantic love in Delirium and Matched, or like in Match specifically, like the choice we have in romantic love. Natural beauty in Uglies, which ends up also being like Descent in general, because the surgery in Uglies, spoiler alert, is also meant to like smooth out not only their face but their brain.
Wow.
So it makes them better citizens. So it demonizes any type of individuality, which is very relevant for our argument.
And I think also just relevant in the Hunger Games, yeah, like none of these things are banned per se. But if you look at the difference between the capital and the district, the capital is like plastic surgery, la la la.
Yeah.
It's still taking away something that we as the audience will find quite normal and making that seem worse than whatever is going on in the capital.
Yes. I want to talk about the depiction of the capital in a quick second, because that's exactly it. Like, the Hunger Games didn't necessarily ban a specific thing as much as they took away a lot of freedoms that only the capital has. But when we talk about like the capital or like big bad government, I think it's very cool to visualize it, especially if you've seen these movies, because a lot of the time the cities in these books and movies and the government like behind them are like portrayed as very cold, pristine, clinical, futuristic in a way that feels soulless. And even the capital kind of has this like grandeur of like big marble buildings that do not contain the history of them. They're just kind of like fake. So there's, I think that always contrasts with like the world of our protagonist that feels more authentic. It feeds into these trope or this tendency of YA dystopia to focus on the future, because it focuses on like a technology and a future that is so devoid of humanity and so obsessed with technology that they have like corrupted nature. So in the case of the Hunger Games, we see that with like literally like the Jabberjays, the Mockingjays, like the idea that we've taken natural species and mutated them to like oppress people, kill children.
Yeah.
And in general, there is just like a sense of doom and loss of humanity linked with the sense that with the loss of our connection to nature and our connection to each other, which again, the youth is disempowered, the youth is often punished, and they're treated like as either like weapons or sources of entertainment, so not really human beings and just as tools for the greater authority. And that contrasts with the tropes of what we call the wilds, which is usually the place of rebellion or the place of dissent or the place that exists outside of big bad government or at the margins. We are calling it that because Delirium called it that, and it's perfect. In Delirium, it is where the invalids, do not cancel me, live, which are the people who decided not to have the surgery to not feel love, or that the surgery failed. So they live outside of the wall that divides society or like civilized society with like the rest of them. In Uglies, it is called the smoke. Basically, it is the idea that all of the people who rebelled or at least defected from the evil society and decided to live by their own rules form like their own civilization outside of the cities, and they often, as a trope, live closer to nature, in the woods or in the ruins of old cities, and although they're not perfect because, you know, there are things like the scavengers in Delirium, they are more often than not usually the good guys, the people who live in the wilds.
It's also, for me, this whole trope reminds me of like when, I don't know, white people look at children in Africa who are playing with their little soccer ball or whatever and are like, wow, they're so happy. They don't need a smartphone to be happy. It's got that vibe of like they have nothing but each other and that's enough.
You're so right. Again, it's like this very juvenile way of understanding the world, because these books are 1,000% read by cosmopolitan girlies whose mom takes them to school, like us. But we are like, wow, what if I just lived in the in the Oregon woods. Like, that is generally the vibe. But I think it just kind of stems from this, like, very human thing that the books build. That is, like, evil is, like, extreme order. And good is, like, natural chaos. That, like, these people who live in the wilds are closer to the readers because they are more normal. They are more childlike. They are more wild. They live where the wild things are. They are closer to nature, but also closer to each other. They get to love. They get to touch. They get to live under their own rules, which makes them the good guys. And this will be relevant for later.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say, though, that the Hunger Games doesn't do this necessarily. Because there is no such thing as the wilds, there is a contrast between the capital and the districts, but there isn't, like, as much of a tropey, like, some people live in the woods outside of the capital. That's it. The capital is a very interesting thing to analyze, I think, especially now that we're adults, because generally, so to the 3 people listening, what is the difference between the capital and LA? Let me know. Like, let me know. Let me know. It's just a bunch of, like, very fashion forward, fruity looking people watching reality TV with questionable morals. Like, what? Like it's so it's like the point of why we don't like the capital is because obviously they hoard the resources and they, like, benefit from the inequality of Panem, and also because they're complicit in the Hunger Games and they're, like, the people who watch and donate and all these things. But if we talk about, like, the aesthetics of big bad government in Uglies, let's say, very futuristic, very gray, very shiny, versus the aesthetics of the capital, full of people who are putting on a lot of makeup, binge eating, and then throwing up, which is stressful because it's about hoarding resources, but still, like, eating as much as they can and just doing a lot of outrageous plastic surgery. It feels like it's almost demonizing the frivolity of wealth and choice, but in a way that to me feels like fruity. Like, what's Hunter Schafer's name? Tigris. If Tigris is evil, then, like, so am I. You know, like, like, I don't know. There's something about that. I know they're complicit in inequality and oppression, but the idea that it is District 12, the Amish-looking people, who are, like, the good guys versus the flamboyant, fashion-obsessed capital citizens who are the bad guys, kind of has this vibe where it kind of feeds into the heteronormativity, an extreme just normativity of some of the aspects of the Hunger Games that I just wanted to point out. Let me know how the capital is different than LA and New York.
I so agree. The capital looks like the fucking Pride Parade.
Yes! I'm so sorry. And we are here and we're queer. But, like, genuinely though, like, Katniss is so cool because she has a bow and arrow, but where is her flag? Is she proud?
If Effie is wrong, I don't want to be right.
Exactly.
Her entire crime is being born in the capital. Like, fight me if you want, but Effie's whole deal is, oh, darling, you look fabulous. We're gonna make you feel so good. We're gonna get you so many sponsors. That's my job. I'm a publicist.
I want to work for people in the capital. Hire me. I want to work for people with one too many plastic surgeries, who are not afraid to dress wildly. Hire me. I'm a writer. And I think this is a symptom of the fact that the Hunger Games is slightly more nuanced because we can actually talk about, like, all of the ways that our life benefits from oppression in the same way that the lives of the capital people benefit from oppression. There is no clear divide in the Hunger Games. There is no wilds. And I think that is one of the strongest points of the Hunger Games, because it doesn't pose this opposition between rebel and like the rebels, District 13, and the capital in a way that demonizes outrageous fashion and plastic surgery. It's more like these are a symptom of the loss of humanity in this society, instead of the cause in things like Delirium and Uglies. So because there's this lack of a wild place, or the wilds in the Hunger Games, we end up with District 13, who are the rebels, but they are not, again, wild. They're not like closer to nature. They live in like a bunker-like city, and in fact, in the Hunger Games lore, they actually benefited from the Civil War. They basically told the Capitol, you will let us go free out of your rules and out of your oppression as long as like you punish the other 12 districts, because we have nuclear weapons. So it's so interesting that the rebels in the Hunger Games are specialized in technology, nuclear power, and if anything are as far away from nature and humanity than the Capitol is. District 13 is evil, they're calculating. There's the whole thing with Prim where, spoiler alert, it's been 10 years, 14. Prim's death is actually made to kind of frame the Capitol for the death of all of these like young medics, but it is created and it is caused by District 13, so that both the Capitol and Katniss sympathize with District 13 and hate the Capitol.
Yeah.
It's a strategy. They're calculating their evil. They're also about chaos and rules and honestly PR. And aesthetically, they are way more similar to the world of Uglies than they are to the Smoke.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very nuanced take because it focuses on how even like someone who stands against power can themselves be corrupted by it, which we have the whole thing where like District 13 wants to do another set of the Hunger Games but with Capitol children to punish the Capitol, like this idea that like all power corrupts, which is very nuanced for a children's book, but also gives this vibe that we will discuss later, that no matter what, we are kind of unable to govern ourselves, because as soon as we have kind of order and extreme authority, we will be either President Coin or President Snow. Mom and Dad.
Mommy and Daddy.
Mommy and Daddy.
Tom Blythe, what up?
He is Daddy. Oh no, not Darcy.
Darcy wants to have a say.
Darcy wants to have a say. If he meows again, I will do something.
Speaking of Mommy and Daddy.
Okay, 1 second. I'm gonna let the cat in.
Okay. Speaking of Mommy and Daddy, what we've been getting at is one of the oldest themes, tropes, whatever you want to call it, story structures we have in literature, that opposition between the quote-unquote wilds and aesthetic of the capital / the clinical, cold, calculated big bad government is essentially, well, at least aesthetically, the conflict of man versus nature.
Yes, which I think is important because it is present in almost all YA dystopias, because YA dystopia is interested in exploring the relationship between humanity and nature, humanity and technology, and in that, what makes us human. There is a great quote by environmentalist Rachel Cart.
Wow. Darcy.
Man versus nature. Was I silent or was I silenced? Goodbye. Get out. That was Darcy. We will feature him more in future episodes. He's a great guest and very opinionated.
Oh, you're reading the Rachel Carson quote.
Yes, I was reading the Rachel Carson quote because YA, as silly and tropey as it is, I think is very concerned with what makes us human.
Uh-huh.
And in a way that is very much every good story ever, and I will give it to YA, the world around the protagonist should reflect the protagonist's concerns. So I got thinking about that because of this quote by environmentalist Rachel Carson that says, and I quote, "Man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself," end quote. So there is this vibe of like a society in decline, of random rules that oppress people, and also of a love story that brings it all together. I think it is just about how these authors and these books and these texts see romance as the answer to the decline of society. And it's not as silly as we want to make fun of. Just thinking about older dystopias. In 1984, Winston Smith's world and beliefs are also shaken when he gets a crush, when he starts his affair with Julia. And in pursuing this affair, his world expands, he learns about the rebellion, he understands more about the powers of the world he lives in and how he's complicit in them. So Orwell understood that love, romance, sexuality, all of that is one of the most powerful incentives for a character, but also for humans to change and to act. However, he was way more cynical about the state of the world, and as you know, by the end of in 1984, the ending shows that Orwell does not believe that love is enough to take down the government, but it is enough to awaken a sort of humanity that that government has taken away. I was reading this essay that mentioned this book called "In a Dark Time: The Apocalyptic Temper in the American Novel of Nuclear Age" by Joseph Dewey, which, again, to bring back your quote by Roberta Trites, this is from 1990, and it is talking about the trend of literature as a response of the Cold War and nuclear power, but it is so relevant to YA, even though YA barely mentions nuclear power, because Joseph Dewey talks about the importance of these books. He writes, and I quote, "Contemporary American literature is finding a way to encompass the meaning, if not the fact, of the nuclear threat. The literature," and I quote again, "found the way to guide its most authentic characters to positions where, despite the reconciliation to the menace of instant and hence meaningless death, there pulses the will to live and to love in a fragile world," end quote. He continues to say that these narratives of hope, quote, "salvage human life with its dignity and passion in the face of evidence that human life has been reduced to the murderous calculus of species genocide," end quote. So this is all to say that there is a great importance in love and romance in narratives about the end of the world or authoritarian regimes. Romantic love and plots in these post-apocalyptic or dystopian narratives feel a bit random because they are able to take down the government in these cases, but they are life affirming as love is in real life. And I think, as all of the writers of these books think, they are like the core of who we are as a species. We are, you know, at the end of the day, pack animals who protect life, stick together, find, you know, functioning communities and family units, and are moved by love as one of like the strongest forces and kind of like the most unexplainable things that we experience. Love is the key to who we are, and in these books it provides a sense that not everything is lost. No matter how fucked the world is, there is always gonna be just a boy for you're just a girl who might make you feel like it is worth changing the world. It feels very random that a singular love affair is like the one domino piece that leads to a coup. But I think it is just because these novels are so concerned, and these movies are so concerned with humanity.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, though, talking about love, like romantic love and sex and sexuality, or the feeling of desire, I guess, as like the catalyst for regaining humanity, or, you know, as you said, the domino piece that makes the other domino pieces fall. Because, yeah, like that's cute and all in a story like The Hunger Games, where love specifically isn't banned, but to make that quote unquote solution be the one thing that is actually banned in society is a bit like wild as a philosophical premise, because that thing, that like the banning of romantic heterosexual love is never gonna happen. Like that's an insane what if situation to like hold a mirror up to society.
But I think, okay, so that's the thing. I think that's too distilled. Like, what we're talking about in this anatomy of YA is like, in the face of arbitrary rules and extreme order and authoritarianism, free will, including just the ability to fall in love and make your own decisions about that love, is the answer. But if you distill it to love is the answer, therefore no love is the question, then it is insane. Yeah. There is just this sense of like romance interacting with big bad government as, to me, not only man versus nature, but also like order versus chaos. You have big bad government being extreme, order that takes away something innate and beautiful and chaotic that then is love. And love to me feels like nature, like it is a natural force. To give Delirium all its credit, because I love it, the end of Delirium is, spoiler alert, no one has ever read this, the guy who Lena falls in love with, who like introduces her to this brand new world of like non-conformity, gets captured. And the end words are, I love you, remember they cannot take this away from us. That is, I think, all of YA is like, they can take away our free will, but they cannot take away my crush. Like, they cannot take away that boy. And I don't know, it just feels so human to be like, the only way to find extreme order is through like this organic, emotional, spiritual thing that is like a crush when you're 16. Even though we can fabricate everything on a lab, like a weird reptile that eats a character in book 3, or we can destroy everyone with a giant weapon, or we can smooth brains. When it comes to like themes and narratives, it makes sense that like romance is the one thing that they cannot take away. It is the smallest and most natural first instance of rebellion against this extreme order. Which is also feels very teenage, because I feel like there's something so adolescent about liking someone you shouldn't like and dating someone your big authority, whether it's President Snow or your auntie, like doesn't want you to be dating. So somehow romance in its chaos is the answer to saying fuck you to the big authority, but also to regaining the balance of what makes us human. And I think that is why YA works, because it is about how silly it is to like a boy who you shouldn't like, but also how powerful it is to go against the status quo in the most, probably the strongest emotion you feel when you're 16.
So Mijin has presented a really intricate and deep musing and thesis on how the representation of love in dystopian literature reminds of why we love and why we make art and all the beautiful things in life. And I'm here to rip that apart and tell you that maybe we just like seeing boy and girl kiss, and that tickles something in our brains, because there is something about YA literature and children's literature in general that relies on tropes and traditions and, you know, us filling in the gaps of a pretty simple world that I can only describe as like narrative symmetry, particularly in its world building. We've talked about fairy tales and I think literally every single episode of this podcast.
Yes.
But
we love
it
them.
is what fairy tales also rely on and why they feel so timeless and why they're retold and rearranged over and over again and we never get tired of it. It's that black and white view of the world, that good king versus bad king archetype that we keep falling back on. And in YA dystopia, it's not different in that sense. They, like, authors of YA literature really just cannot and don't have the scope for making their fictional societies and fictional dystopias too morally muddy. For children's literature, it needs to stay relatively sanitized with a pretty clear divide of what's quote-unquote good and quote-unquote evil. And for that to sort of happen, there needs to be a sort of clear instinctual idea of where we desire our heroes to end up. So like the forced order of the capital, or, you know, the Portland in Delirium.
DFA, Delirium, what? Delirium Forces Against America? Delirium Free America! Delirium Free America. Yes. The DFA.
Exactly. Like, whatever the big bad government, the BBG, is doing to divide society has to come head to head with the organic fate of the heterosexual love the protagonists have. So there's this sense of like, of course, Peta gets reaped with Katniss and he secretly loves her. And of course, Triss is divergent, just like Tobias is divergent in Divergent. And of course they all fall in love. It just kind of like makes narrative sense, like boy plus girl equals the solution.
It makes narrative sense is our entire episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course. Like that's how tropes work. Like obviously just a girl is really good with bow and arrow. It's like coincidence slash fate slash, again, this like instinctual, that's just what happens, taken to the extreme, which is to say, for us anyway, it's heteronormativity taken to the extreme. The just a boy, just a girl thing, having to fall in love, is heteronormativity. I mean, okay, The Hunger Games, I will forever defend this series. I guess Suzanne Collins is just a really good writer, but it's less organic for Katniss and Peeta in the sense that they don't actually fall in love, at least from Katniss's perspective, until much, much later. And the whole thing with The Hunger Games is that they do play the part of that trope that we just think makes so much sense, and the Capitol thinks makes so much sense. Like, it's the Romeo and Juliet narrative, the star-crossed lover thing. We fill in the gaps by ourselves.
Yes. Which is to say that even if you ban heterosexuality, as we've been continuing to say, even if you ban romantic love, or you ban the possibility of choosing romantic love of your choice, of whoever that is, it doesn't make heterosexuality radical. And I think that's what we're getting at. That the only way that these books could make falling in love with a boy when you're a girl radical is to then make the whole world upside down. So in a way, this kind of like just right, what makes narrative sense, is kind of the status quo. Like, you have like an unnatural world that it's returned to its balance through a natural narrative of boy likes girl, which is why it feels kind of silly to have radical politics be mixed with like traditional relationship structures, and why as queer women of color we look at these and we are like, why was I so invested in two straight people kissing, and that was gonna like end all inequality. So that is all to say that narrative had to kind of create this inorganic order that could only be answered by what we traditionally think as organic and natural. And why do we think that, you ask? Maybe.
If you're us, you do.
There is a more popular book out there than Hunger Games in this genre of boy meets girl takes down big bad government, and that is The Bible by Not Jesus. So,
have you heard of The Good Book?
Have you heard of The Good Book? We are here in your living room, in your ears, telling you that the Bible and Hunger Games are maybe the same thing.
If you read Paradise Lost, you'll see that Eden is indeed a dystopian government.
Again, I am so sorry. This is the third episode we've mentioned Paradise Lost and Adam and Eve in. But we are basic bitches, and so is all of storytelling. So, again, like, we just need to sit for a second and examine that Adam and Eve is boy meets girl in a way in matched. Adam and Eve is matched. Like, God gave Eve to Adam because it made sense and he was lonely, and it was kind of like, this is your one girl. And then one girl, girly, just a girl, the first girl, the girl said, I think there's more. Like, said, basically the fruit of knowledge. It also, like, introduced, like, sexuality and sin and all of the terrible misogynistic things, supposedly. Please read his Dark Materials for a way better take on this. But the fruit of knowledge was what crumbled this fake paradise. And whether you think that we're trying to return to it through death and Catholicism and Christianity, or if it's a good thing that we have free will, it is this idea of like paradise by big bad government that included like forced pairing of our protagonist, and the rebellion against it leads to free will and freedom of choice. The things that are not had in paradise.
You say all of this, and all I can think is Eve a manic pixie dream girl?
Eve is the only girl, so she's not like other girls. Indeed, she's correct.
I'm not like other girls. I was born from your rib.
I am not like other girls. Other girls want to be me. I am mother to other girls.
Capital M mother.
Exactly.
She could never.
And I want to say, Adam, like Peeta and Alex and the boy from Divergent 4 is just some fucking dude. Like, he's just some dude. Eve is cool. Adam is just some guy. He's just Ken. And I don't know, there's something about that feel. I think this is why this idea of like boy meets girl takes down government, or love being dangerous and against status quo, against Big Daddy who sets random rules like you have to get a surgery at 16 to make yourself pretty, and also don't eat that apple, arbitrary as fuck. It feels very natural. It feels like this long, like the oldest story told. And I think that's why it really functions in dystopia. I don't think necessarily dystopia is a Catholic retelling in the way that, again, His Dark Materials is, but it utilizes this eternal biblical story where we have a world that needs to be, you know, procreated, a world that we did not create, and where our heroine bites the apple and gains the ability to decide how her world is gonna look like. And whether that makes the fool fortunate or not is another thing, but it is like a powerful thing to defy the arbitrary rules of this big bad world. That takes us to, if Katniss bit the apple and took down, you know, the government, what happens to her? Like, what happens to Katniss? What is her fate? What happens to Eve?
I think the one thing that everyone kind of agreed on when it came to the Hunger Games, even back in the day, was that the ending, like the epilogue of Mockingjay, was really fucking weird and out of character for Katniss specifically. Because if you don't remember, it ends with her literally in a meadow or like a field, I don't know, with her 2 kids who she's had with PETA. And if you know anything about Katniss, if you know anything about the Hunger Games, Katniss is resolute in not wanting to have kids. Because the world is so awful and et cetera, et cetera. What a terrible thing it would be to bring a child into this world. And that's the through line she maintains throughout the whole series. And at the end, we get a jump scare with 2 kids. And it's kind of like, why did Suzanne Collins choose to end this series that for the most part is pretty nitty gritty with this really Edenic, idyllic scene? Katniss with her 2 kids and PETA by her side. It's because, and this is the thing with dystopias in general, it's really hard to imagine what happens after you've brought the world back from its end. There's a pretty well-known quote that goes, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." In our case, it's more like it's easier to imagine our return to Eden, capital P paradise, than it is to build a better world from the one we have now.
This quote is like, we stumbled upon it on researching post-apocalyptic literature, because it is kind of like, oh, it's so much easier to imagine the world ending than actually the root of a lot of these issues like climate change and inequality, which is capitalism. So that's why apocalyptic literature is like so good, because we're kind of like, oh, I would much rather imagine the end of everything than understand like the end of capitalism. And in this case it's kind of the same thing. We're like, we've imagined the end and then we've engaged with how to bring it back, but we do not know what comes next. And I wanted to point out with the end of the Hunger Games, like, if we're again talking about aesthetics, we go from District 12, which is kind of the closest thing we have to the wilds, where like we hunt with bow and arrow, we eat squirrels, our protagonist is wearing like a leather jacket very famously, and like almost like Doc Martens like type of books, like, you know, like hunter gatherer boots, like whatever. We go from this like almost like masculine hunter gatherer aesthetic, like throughout, like this is who Katniss is at the beginning, to then her wearing a fucking sundress. Like she goes back to kind of way stereotypical femininity and stereotypical feminine roles, like being mother and wife, which again feels like a betrayal to who Katniss is and Katniss was, but I think is again the most natural knee-jerk reaction of, we have done it, her masculinity has served its purpose, and we will now return to paradise. We will return to what we always were meant to do, which is just, you know, boy, girl, kiss, have kids. That's why I think it doesn't feel, it's the less nuanced part of the Hunger Games. It's, as Felicia was saying, this kind of thing with dystopian YA, where we've spent 3 or whatever amount of books concerned with how to take down the government and how to kiss 2 boys at once, and then it kind of ends. Like, Delirium ends with, we're gonna be okay, we've taken down the government. A lot of these things just end in the idea that we've killed authority and not really concerned with what comes next and how to do it and how to build a better world.
It's this thing where we are always able to criticize, we're always able to complain. It's that thing of teenagers hating parents and teachers or, any authority placed above them. But it also has this vibe that, like, okay, you've done your kicking and screaming, but ultimately you can't govern yourself. And you shouldn't govern yourself because you wouldn't know what to do with it. And you should instead just return to that thing that we are all so innately aware of and innately able to return to, which is Mother Nature, motherhood, family, heterosexuality, heteronormativity. Back to the prairie in District 12 where our children are husband await. And this idea that which makes us inherently human is inherently at odds with a society, like a governed society.
Yeah. It's very, like, the whole man versus nature, big government versus the wilds is genuinely, like, authority versus freedom. So at the end, our protagonists choose to defer that choice because they know they will eventually have to govern themselves in this society, or they choose this kind of, like, freedom that feels idyllic but also feels incredibly conservative and heteronormative.
So what does this all mean? And what does it say about the readers and the authors? And what does it say about us, knowing that when our brains were at their most valuable, this is all we consumed? Is it because of what happens when you reach teenagerhood? Like the first time you start questioning the world and you start becoming #woke and, having access to information and, critical thinking, coinciding with the first time you like someone, the first time you kiss someone, and like, where do we go from here? Like, what is the point of all of this? For me anyway, these books were the first times where I read about a character who I could relate to, as in she wasn't the capital C, capital O chosen one. She had no particular powers other than just some street smarts, really. So like, that's really accessible, right? The first time I was reading about a character that was like that, who was able to question the status quo and actually affect change based on her own beliefs. Also in that era of reading about feminism for the first time in a critical way, I was able to like read a quirky adventure story that does actually question what if in a society that I could see mirroring my own. And it's that bittersweet moment of reaching adulthood, or getting into adulthood and being able to think for yourself and realizing both the beauties of like kindness in the world, but also the harsh reality of like societal inequality, and also that idea that I'm a person in the world who could affect change and I have free will. So yeah, for me it was like the graduation from Percy Jackson, pretty much, like just a regular kid going off on an adventure with her friends. But also, what if society was like super evil in a way that we can't even imagine?
Yeah. And I think this the idea of rebellion that is so important. But at the end of the day, it is like rebellion as you say, like a graduation, as like the first time you start questioning, you start doing adult things, which for a teenager, the first kind of adult thing you can do is fall in love, get a boyfriend. Like before you get a car, you can get a crush, And I think what we're getting at is that while these dystopias build entire worlds and try to engage in like economics and politics, they are YA dystopias. Like they are YA first and dystopias later. They are more concerned with growing up and understanding like what type of world we want to lead, which again is why I think everything is very black and white, and why there is a call to the wild. Like there is an understanding of not everything has to be like this, and I maybe want more community or maybe want more freedom than the ones that my authority figures are giving me.
To quote Roberta S. Trites again, who I quoted earlier in the episode, in the same book, Disturbing the Universe, two types of authority are especially pertinent to YA novels: authority within the text and the authority of the author over the reader. Within the text, authority is often depicted as a struggle with a parent or a parent substitute. So, YA dystopia is all about putting the teenage protagonist at odds with her world and giving her a big bad government to represent authority in her own life, the ultimate unfair and arbitrary authority of her own life, parents and other adults. As Trite says, the struggle against authority is a struggle with a parent or a parent substitute. It's about feeling powerless against a greater system that rule your life, and then having the bravery to stand up against them, one forbidden relationship at a time.
Yeah, and it is the act of rebellion that these books are, the act of rebellion, feeling like there's a huge system that gives you arbitrary rules, like you cannot date that boy and you have to get this thing done, or you cannot do this and you cannot do that. It is concerned with analyzing, portraying that authority and taking it down, and less concerned with what to do after you've staged a coup. Like, it feels like the most teenage thing in the world to rebel against the status quo without knowing what to do after that. To crave ultimate freedom, but that freedom feels juvenile. And then to just imagine, kind of like in the Hunger Games, where you just kind of like, you just imagine that once you get that power, you will blink and you will be an adult and everything will be fine. Mm-hmm. So this idea inherent in YA that we are unable to govern ourselves definitely plays on conservative and Christian beliefs and ideas that I think should still be questioned, as much as the lack of like queer representation because of these ideas and because of this quote unquote narrative symmetry, why we believe these things are symmetrical and natural. But I don't think they're necessarily like come from like a sinister, like heteronormative, apolitical impulse from these authors. I think they're more like a symptom of the adolescence of the readers and the protagonists of these books, where we cannot fathom being our own parents and governing our lives. So we just don't. Yeah. So we end the narrative there.
Yeah. I mean, like, to be fair, in most of these YAs, the end goal of the protagonist isn't to become the next dictator. I say that, and Shatter Me definitely was. Or it wasn't the end goal, but it does happen. So, yeah, to give all the credit to them, fair enough.
Yeah. And even if it is very black and white, capital versus districts, wilds versus big bad government, Adam and Eve against God narrative, we gotta point out that Eve chooses knowledge and sexuality instead of literal paradise, and so did every heroine that wasn't like other girls but was like Eve after her. We have bitten the fruit of knowledge, and we have realized how complicated the world is, especially when we're 16 and 17, and we realize that we then have to make decisions, that these books become about the anxiety of the fall as well as the anxiety of having fallen and wanting to go back to a place where, you know, we are governed. We want to kind of not really think about what we're going to do with this big white scary world without a capital G government to make it all okay.
Yeah, and that's such a trope of dystopia/utopias and speculative fiction in general. It's that continuous exercise in imagination, that continuous trying to imagine a better or worse world, trying and continuously asking what if, no matter how silly or uncalled for. It's like a game, isn't it?
And there are indeed much worse games to play.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Gifted Child Symposium. We hope you found it interesting, thought-provoking, and if nothing else, amusing. Please leave a review on whatever your preferred podcast platform is, as it really helps us out. And if you really enjoyed, please share us with your friends. You can find us on Instagram at giftedcs.pod. We'd love to hear from you.
Talking about much worse games to play. Much worse. My girlfriend introduced me to YA dystopias, but make it actually conservative. So, not Adam and Eve once you spent an hour and a half deconstructing the Hunger Games, but what if this was about 15-minute cities? Comes in this novel, which apparently is going to be a series. Please stop.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Chasing Embers by Glenn Beck, who's like the founder of a conservative media channel and whatever the fuck. Not founder, CEO, I don't know. I don't know shit about it. Shout out to Jose, my boy. Just Jose on YouTube, at Jose Bird. We love you. You made a 48 or something minute video and you read this book for that video. God bless you. But yeah, through this video, I have been introduced to the fact that there is indeed a much worse thing than to put two straight people kissing as radical, and it is to put like a society where 15-minute cities is panem.
Yeah, like, so Mijin told me about this and was like, the dystopia is 15-minute cities. And in my head, I thought, oh, so like figuratively, right? Like, as in, the society that the author is describing is a 15-minute city. No. It's literally called a 15-minute city by the author, because I don't think the author knows what a 15-minute city is.
No, definitely not. There's this understanding of like, it's like a huge country, right, under a corporation that leads it, but also the community is only a 15-minute city. So let me know, is it just a bunch of 15-minute cities like side by side, which at that point that's just London. I don't know what he means.
Do watch the full video. It's really enjoyable. It's called Reviewing a Conservative Young Adult Novel. But as like a preview, because I don't think we can do it justice in
it's a great
this
video.
postscript. It's like a sort of Fahrenheit 451 style world in which knowledge has been banned, and specifically history has been like erased from the non-existent books. But specifically like a very American Christian evangelical city. So forbidden knowledge such as Christopher Columbus came to the Americas in 14 whatever the fuck with the idea that all men are created equal.
Yeah. So it takes all of the tropes of dystopia, but instead of being like, oh, like Big Brother is erasing the way that it's oppressing the rest of the world and conquering, it's like we are no longer able to pray. Like it equates like genuine just facts, like Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1942. What? 1492? Good night. I wish 1942. We could have stopped them. But anyway, in 1492, it equates that with like there's this scene that Jose describes, where the parents of the protagonist, of course, are taken away by big bad government, and they start reciting this forbidden, forgotten history. But it's shit like with liberty and justice for all. Like, it's just random shit. And it's so insane. If you listen to that video, the like big baddie, or like the secretary under the big baddie, is called Azaz Ilo, which like Katniss Everdeen could never. You know, like it's like these names are so insane. The building of it is so insane. There's a lot of like, tracking devices, which is just straight out of Uglies. Like, it's so tropey, but it uses it to create a narrative in which Christian conservatives are oppressed.
It dares you to imagine a world in which you too can live 15 minutes away from a hospital, school, and supermarket.
Yes, and that is evil. It's fucking insane. I think that's the kind of point of like the danger of tropes. Because I was like listening to that and I was like, my script is very similar. like my script uses the same trope, but my script uses it to like further Latina representation. You know, like that's the thing with tropes, that they generally just can't be used for anything. And I think we should watch out for these new YA dystopias coming out from the other side of the aisle. Because they are not preoccupied with what makes us human. They're not preoccupied with the power of love to enact change in our society. They're preoccupied with the idea that wokeness is the big bad government.